Are you frightened of change? Change? Are you somebody who lives in a routine? You get up, you have breakfast, you go off to work, you spend most of the day at work, perhaps have something at lunch, maybe a sandwich, same old thing. You get back on the train and you come home and then maybe just nip out to a convenience shop, buy something in a box, stick it in the microwave and heat it up, and then watch a bit of television in the evening and repeat. Are you somebody who has a routine? And if there's change in that routine, it throws you asunder. Or are you somebody who thrives on change? Every day is a different day. You don't know where you are. Maybe you're one of these people like I used to be, self-employed, and sometimes I'd be working on TV programs as an extra. Other times I would be booked as an entertainer, juggling and unicycling at some Park Lane hotel, doing all sorts of comedy characters and things like that. Maybe you are somebody who works in an office some days, and maybe you work at home, or maybe you have to go onto an aeroplane and fly over to different countries. Change is a fascinating thing. And I think that we're going through a massive amount of change, but rather rapidly at the moment. And I think of my dad, my dear old dad, who's now no longer with us. He was born in the 30s, and I think of his life. He died at about 84, I think it was, when he died. Not the year, in his 80s, his early 80s he died, in 2017. And I think about the things that he had seen in his lifetime. In the early 30s, he would have been aware possibly of the early commercial flights, for example. The Second World War would have come along, and technology that came along with all of that. The sort of family, the way the family was run would be changed. Women would go to work, of course. In the 60s, we saw a lot of new buildings, brutalist architecture coming in, some of the older buildings coming down. Perhaps we saw some of the slums being cleared, things like that. And, of course, those buildings that were once called slums now in, say, London are extremely expensive, over £1 million just to live in what was the poorest sort of streets that you could imagine. Change has been around with us. Imagine the technology that's gone. My dad possibly seeing the old wireless and the cat's whisker, crystal radios, until now we see, of course, MP3 players and streaming technology, and we're being pushed ever more into digital. And is change good? Is change good? Is change good for the sake of it, or is the progression of change good? That's what I'm curious to know from you, the lovely audience, or to sort of dwell upon and think about in today's monologue. Is change good at the pace of change, the going into this digital world, in which, of course, so much on the digital world can be manipulated? AI, for example, can produce pictures of people who don't even exist. People can be falling in love with images of fine young members of the opposite sex or the same sex and think that they actually are real, and yet they've been generated by computers. And it is a wonder that we've been directed in certain places by technology, but also by nefarious minds who've been trying to program us, as we've seen with the television and the feature films in which the future is being projected and softening us up for this future that we may or may not want. And I've been thinking a lot, because I'm curious about the food situation and the highly processed foods that we are being encouraged to eat ever more in the advertising on the television or on the internet. Everywhere we go, this food, and the idea that farming is going to change. In fact, they'll have no food, no farmers and no food, that will have synthetic food, that modern man, clever modern man in the chemists, in the chemistry offices can produce food that is basically chemically supposed to give us all the nutrients that we want, but is completely artificial. And I'm not convinced. I'm just so not convinced that people like Bill Gates have got the answer with his burgers and GM foods, or that worms and insects are really the things that we actually want. And I think that so much of what we've been seeing in this modern world, particularly with the big pharma and the big agricultural and the big banks and all of these big corporations, corporate Britain, is just not human. It's not essential for us as people, as living and breathing people. I feel that we are being turned into drones more and more with the 15-minute cities and the digital IDs and the lack of compassion for one another that seems to be all over the place. And it made me think, what would history have been like if, for example, the likes of Nikola Tesla had been, and his inventions had been allowed to continue? If we had developed some of those health things that he came up with, or the free energy, what kind of life would we have had? And what kind of life would have happened if we continued to go at meal times around the table and bring the family in and talk about the day and eat wholesome food, rather than allow kids just to disappear up to their bedrooms on the computers and not gather together and have a community moment in our daily lives in our own homes? And what would have happened if instead of the big farming had changed, that we not quite stayed in this old-fashioned image here of the milkmaid milking, but instead of making everything automatic, huge farms, massive fields of monoculture, that we kept with small local farms, seasonal, what kind of life would we have now? Would we be living and thriving a hell of a lot more? And what about our authority figures? If we had stayed with those who had, like Dixon of Dock Green here, a little bit more compassion, dressed up in their uniforms and were proud, and that we had respect for our services, like the police and like the doctors and various others. It seems that we have lost a lot of that respect because these authority figures seem to have turned against us and see us in very much as people to persecute. I know that firsthand when 3 policemen seemed to be on the side of an enforcement officer when I drove into Bath and somehow infringed by just driving into the city in a clean air zone that was not any signs available and no tariffs on display, and yet somehow these rules and laws are fed against us. What kind of life would it be if we had restarted back in the 1930s and had those times again, the lifespan of my father, but actually we kept hold of the goodness. We didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what I feel that has happened. If we kept those traditions and customs that were important to us, would we be having a far better life today if our governments were actually doing the bidding of the people rather than dominating and telling us in dictatorship style what we are going to have? If we had continued to keep those wonderful family values, the things that matter to us over the years, as technology progressed, instead of getting into big capitalization in which corporations seem to have taken over, what kind of a world would it have been? Well, that's the kind of change that I haven't really enjoyed. I was part of it. Of course, being a child of the 60s, I didn't know any different. But it's only when you get to a certain age and you start to reflect and you go, actually, do you know what? This experiment that we've done for the last 100, maybe 150 years, has not been quite the way I think it should have been done. There's so many things that we've thrown away, the small farms being particularly relevant at the time now, in which big amounts of food that's being processed with the pesticides and the insecticides, the monoculture, the lack of compassion from our authority figures, and all of these things. This is an experiment that now has got to come to an end, because beyond where we could go is clearly not beneficial to us as people living in this land. And we've got to do something. And that's why I say, you're frightened of change, you're scared of it, because I feel that we do have to change. We've got to change. But the change that we need is to take back some of those elements from the past and take some of these elements of today. Some of the technology, of course, is useful. I'm not saying it isn't. But some of those core values of the past that we have lost, which were all about us, people, and not about just them and corporation and dead entities. And somehow we've got to mould the two together and say the journey that we're on at the moment is a future that is frightening and scary. And let's not get on that train. Let's get off that one, because that is not. We want to get back on the old charabang and turn out at one of the lovely old seaside resorts where we can have a Kiss Me Quick hat, an ice cream, and sit there and enjoy our family, enjoy our life, wholesome food and good quality living, with a bit of time for one another, compassion and friendliness, instead of this dead entity corporatization of everything, the digital world that is swallowing up our personal interactions, putting us behind screens, which effectively is behind bars and all these 15-minute cities and these new builds that look like concentration camps in which we're being encouraged to spend our money and work harder. I think we do need to change. We need to change and take so much of those core things that meant something to us from the past and push back against the tyranny of the future. That's my thoughts. You may completely disagree, and of course you're totally entitled to disagree. But if we're going to save ourselves, we are having to prepare, I think, for a massive change.